The door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking in the December wind like the bones of the dead. Martha pressed her palm against the rough wood one last time, feeling the splinters catch at her work-worn skin. Behind this door lay everything that had been her life with Samuel. The iron bed frame they'd bought with their last coins, the tin plates still crusted with yesterday's beans, the pickaxe leaning in the corner where he'd left it 3 days ago, before the mine swallowed him whole. She wouldn't take any of it. The dead had no use for memory, and neither did she. Martha pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric barely concealing the gentle swell of her belly. 5 months along, maybe 6. She'd lost count of the days since Samuel's burial. The other miners' wives had stopped calling after the second day, their whispers following her like crows whenever she ventured into town for supplies. Poor thing, they'd say, though their eyes spoke different words. What kind of woman loses her man and carries on so cold-like? Not a tear at the funeral. Not natural, if you ask me. Let them talk. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury the frontier didn't afford. The storm had been building all morning, great gray clouds piling up against the mountains like wool against a carter's brush. Martha had watched it coming while she sorted through their meager possessions, keeping only what would fit in Samuel's old rucksack: a knife, some hardtack, a handful of dried beans, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and the small leather pouch containing their savings, barely enough for a week's lodging, if she could find someone willing to rent to a woman alone. She'd meant to reach Elmwood before nightfall. The settlement was only 15 miles through Beggar's Pass, an easy day's walk in good weather. But the storm had other plans. The first flakes began falling as she locked the door for the last time, and within an hour, the world had disappeared into a whirling white void. The trail vanished beneath the snow. Martha pressed on, following what she thought was the path, her boots crunching through the deepening drifts. The baby moved within her, a flutter like bird wings, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. Just a little farther, she whispered, though whether to the child or herself, she couldn't say. By the time she realized, she'd lost the trail entirely. The storm had become a living thing, howling through the pines with animal fury. The temperature plummeted. Ice formed on her eyelashes, and her fingers grew numb inside her thin gloves. She stumbled forward, searching for any kind of shelter, a rock overhang, a fallen tree, anything to block the wind that cut through her clothes like knives. A memory surfaced, Samuel's voice, warm with whiskey and promise on their wedding night. "I'll build you a proper house, Martha, 2 stories, with glass windows and a parlor for receiving guests. You'll never want for anything, I swear it." She'd believed him then. Young fool that she was. She'd believed every golden word that fell from his lips. The truth was harder. A one-room shack, endless days of loneliness while he worked the mine. And now this, walking through a blizzard with his child in her belly and nowhere to go. The ravine appeared suddenly, a dark gash in the white landscape. Martha's foot slipped on hidden ice, and she tumbled down the slope, her hands clawing uselessly at the snow. She landed hard at the bottom. The breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment she lay still, waiting for the pain that would tell her something was broken. When it didn't come, she struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her stomach. The baby moved again, alive. Thank God. The ravine offered some protection from the wind, but she knew she couldn't stay there. Already her wet clothes were freezing against her skin. She needed fire, shelter, or she'd be dead by morning. The thought came unbidden. Would that be so terrible? To simply lie down in the snow and let the cold take her? Take them both? It would be like going to sleep. They said, peaceful. No. She pushed the thought away with a savage force. She hadn't survived 23 years of hardship to give up now. Not when she carried the last piece of Samuel, the only good thing to come from their brief marriage. Night fell early in the mountains, and with it came new terrors. The storm muffled most sounds, but occasionally she heard them anyway. The long, mournful howl of wolves. Growing closer. They'd be hungry this early in winter. bold enough to come down from the high country. She'd seen what they could do to a calf separated from the herd, and she was easier prey than any calf. Martha found a shallow depression beneath an overhanging rock and pressed herself into it. Her hands shook as she tried to light a match, but the wind extinguished it immediately. The second match broke. She had 6 left. In the brief flare of the third match, she glimpsed dark shapes moving beyond the veil of snow. Yellow eyes caught the light and vanished. "Go on," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Get!" The shapes circled, patient as death itself. She pressed her back against the rock, the knife clutched in her frozen fingers. How long could she hold them off? How long before the cold took her strength, made her slow? The baby kicked, harder this time, as if sensing her fear. Martha closed her eyes, summoning what remained of her will. "I'll starve before I beg," she whispered into the wind. The words came from somewhere deep, a place her mother had carved into her soul with a switch in scripture. "I'll freeze before I beg. I'll die on my feet before I crawl." It was then that she saw him, a tall figure emerging from the storm like something out of a fever dream. For a moment she thought death had finally come for her, wearing the shape of a man. He moved through the snow as if it were nothing, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his face hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat. The wolves melted back into the darkness. Martha raised her knife, though her arms shook with cold and exhaustion. "Stay back," she warned, her voice barely carrying over the wind. The man stopped, his hands held open and empty at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was deep and calm as a mountain lake. "Ma'am, you'll freeze to death out here. I've got a cabin about a mile up the ridge. Fire and food, if you'll have it." "I don't need charity." The words came automatically, even as her teeth chattered. "Ain't charity," he said. "Just one human being helping another. Way I see it, we don't survive out here alone." Martha studied what she could see of his face. Weathered features, a dark beard streaked with gray, eyes that held no threat, only a quiet understanding. She thought of the wolves, the cold, the child growing inside her. Pride was another luxury she couldn't afford. Slowly, she lowered the knife. The climb to the cabin nearly finished what the storm had started. Martha's legs, already weak from cold and exhaustion, trembled with each step up the ridge. The stranger, he hadn't offered his name, walked ahead, breaking trail through the deep snow. Every few minutes he'd glance back, checking that she still followed. Once, when she stumbled, he reached out to steady her, but she jerked away from his touch. "I can manage," she said through gritted teeth. He nodded and continued on, saying nothing. The cabin materialized out of the storm like something from a dream. Solid log walls chinked with mud, a stone chimney releasing a thin stream of smoke into the white sky. It was larger than she'd expected, built with care and skill. This wasn't some temporary shelter thrown together by a drifter, but a real home, made to last. Inside, warmth hit her like a physical thing. She swayed on her feet, suddenly dizzy, and this time when the stranger caught her elbow, she didn't pull away. He guided her to a chair near the stone fireplace where flames crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I'll get you some dry clothes," he said, moving toward a wooden chest in the corner. "They were my sister's. She was about your size." Martha watched him through eyes heavy with exhaustion. He moved with quiet efficiency, pulling out a wool dress, thick stockings, and a heavy shawl. Everything was clean and carefully folded, as if waiting for someone who would never return. What happened to her? The question escaped before she could stop it. His hand stilled on the fabric. "Fever, 2 winters back." "I'm sorry," he shrugged, but she caught the tightness around his eyes. "Change into these. I'll be outside." Alone. Martha peeled off her frozen clothes with difficulty. Her fingers were clumsy, barely able to work the buttons. The dry dress felt like heaven against her skin, and she hugged the shawl around her shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to it. Someone had loved these clothes, had taken care with them. When she called out that she was decent, he returned carrying an armload of firewood. He fed the flames until they roared, then moved to the small kitchen area. She watched him work, filling a pot with snow to melt for water, slicing bacon, measuring coffee grounds. His movements were economical, practiced, those of a man long accustomed to solitude. "Elias," he said suddenly, not turning from the stove. "My name's Elias Thornton. Martha—" She hesitated, then added, "Martha Coleman. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Coleman, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He set a tin plate before her, bacon, beans, and a thick slice of bread. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger, but when she reached for the fork, her pride reared up again. "I can't pay you," she said stiffly. "Not yet." Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups, his expression unreadable. "Did I ask for payment? A woman alone doesn't accept charity from strange men. It gives the wrong impression." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, or understanding. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but you're half frozen, exhausted, and—" His eyes flicked briefly to her belly. "In a delicate condition. This ain't about charity or impressions. It's about not letting another human being die in a blizzard. Now eat before it gets cold." The bacon was perfectly crisp, the beans seasoned with molasses and salt pork, the bread still soft in the middle. Martha forced herself to eat slowly, though hunger urged her to wolf it down. The baby shifted and settled, apparently satisfied. Elias sat across from her, nursing his coffee. Up close, she could study him better. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 35 or 40, with deep lines around his eyes and silver threading through his dark hair. His hands were scarred from work, but his nails were clean, his clothes mended with neat stitches. A man who took care with things. "You're a long way from any settlement," she said finally. "That's the general idea." "Running from something?" His mouth quirked. "Aren't we all?" She had no answer to that, so she concentrated on her food. The cabin was well appointed for a mountain dwelling, shelves lined with preserved goods. Tools hung neatly on the walls, even a few books stacked on a rough-hewn table. One wall held a collection of pelts, another displayed snowshoes and traps. This was the home of someone who knew how to survive, who had made peace with isolation. "There's a lean-to out back," Elias said, breaking the silence. "I'll bed down there tonight. You take the cabin." "I couldn't—" "You could and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "That storm's not letting up any time soon. You need proper rest, especially considering—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks, in the excitement of staying alive. She'd almost forgotten how she must look. A pregnant woman traveling alone, no husband in sight. The good wives of Elmwood would have had plenty to say about that. "My husband is dead," she said flatly. "Cave-in at the mine 3 days ago. I was heading to Elmwood to find work. I'm sorry for your loss." She studied his face, looking for judgment or pity, but found neither. Just simple acknowledgement of a hard truth. It made her bold enough to ask, "And you? What sends a man to live alone on a mountain?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "There was some trouble down in Coyote Creek. Cattle went missing from the Brennan Ranch. I worked there as a hand, so naturally, suspicion fell on me. No proof, but that didn't matter much to a mob with hanging on their minds." "Did you do it?" He met her eyes steadily. "No, but the real thief was the rancher's nephew, and blood's thicker than justice in these parts. It was leave or dance at the end of a rope." Martha absorbed this, recognizing the bitter truth in his words. She'd seen how quickly people turned on outsiders, how readily they believed the worst. "How long have you been up here?" 3 years come spring. It's not a bad life. Quiet, peaceful, lonely sometimes, but," he shrugged, "better than the alternative." The storm rattled the windows, reminding them both of the world outside. Martha suppressed a shiver. Despite the warmth of the fire, without Elias, she'd be frozen by now, food for wolves. The debt sat uneasily on her shoulders. "I'll work for my keep," she said suddenly. "I can cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "And you don't owe me anything. When the storm clears, I'll see you safe to Elmwood if that's still where you want to go." "Why?" The question burst out of her. "Why help me? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. I could rob you blind while you sleep." Elias smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Ma'am, if you were planning to rob me, you picked a poor night for it. Besides, I figure anyone willing to face down a pack of wolves with nothing but a knife isn't the thieving type." Despite everything, Martha felt an answering smile tug at her lips. It felt strange on her face, like wearing someone else's clothes. "Now," Elias said, rising from the table, "you need rest. Tomorrow we'll see about the storm." He gathered blankets and his coat, preparing to brave the cold. At the door, he paused. "Bar this behind me. The wolves shouldn't come this close to the cabin, but it's best to be sure." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. Martha stood at the door for a moment, listening to the storm and thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning she'd been ready to die rather than beg. Now she sat warm and fed in a stranger's home, owing her life to a man whose kindness seemed to ask for nothing in return. She barred the door as he'd instructed and returned to the fire. Her hands went to her belly, feeling the subtle movements within. "We're safe," she whispered to the child. "For tonight, at least, we're safe." But even as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that safety was an illusion, temporary as the warmth of the fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new debts to balance. For now, though, she let herself rest, listening to the storm rage impotently against the solid walls of Elias Thornton's mountain refuge. Dawn broke crystal clear, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Martha woke to sunlight streaming through the frost-etched windows, painting geometric patterns on the rough wooden floor. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for Samuel. Then memory crashed back. The mine, the burial, the storm, and the quiet stranger who had saved her life. She found Elias already at work outside, splitting wood with steady, rhythmic strokes. His breath plumed in the cold air, and ice crystals glittered in his dark beard. He'd cleared a path from the cabin to the woodshed, the snow piled head-high on either side. "Morning," he said without looking up, somehow sensing her presence. "Coffee's on the stove." Martha poured herself a cup, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. Through the window, she watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the careful way he stacked each split log. Everything about him spoke of routine, of a life carved out through discipline and solitude. "I can do that," she called out, pulling on the heavy shawl. He paused mid-swing. "No need. I told you I'd work for my keep, and I told you that wasn't necessary." He split another log with a decisive thunk. "Besides, it's not fitting work for a woman in your condition." Martha felt her spine stiffen. "I've been splitting wood since I was 10 years old. Being with child doesn't make me helpless." Elias lowered the axe, really looking at her for the first time that morning. Whatever he saw in her face made him nod slowly. "Fair enough. There's kindling needs splitting, if you're of a mind. Lighter work, but still useful." They worked in companionable silence as the morning progressed. Martha found a rhythm with the small hatchet, reducing larger pieces to kindling size. The familiar motion soothed her, gave her hands something to do besides worry at the uncertain future. The baby seemed content, occasionally shifting but not protesting the activity. By midday, they'd amassed a considerable wood pile. Elias showed her where he kept his food stores, a root cellar dug into the hillside, lined with shelves of preserved goods. Smoked venison hung from the rafters alongside strings of dried herbs. Jars of wild berries gleamed like jewels in the dim light. "You did all this yourself?" Martha asked, genuinely impressed. 3 years is plenty of time to get established." He selected a portion of smoked meat and a jar of preserves. "A man learns to provide for himself up here, or he doesn't last the winter." Back in the cabin, Martha insisted on preparing the noon meal. She found his kitchen well organized, everything in its place. As she worked, she told him about the rumors that had driven her from town. They said Samuel had been drinking when the mine collapsed, she said, slicing bread with perhaps more force than necessary. Said he'd been careless, brought it on himself. As if any amount of whiskey could make a man deserving of being buried alive. Elias leaned against the doorframe, listening. People need someone to blame when bad ththings happen, makes them feel safer. Thinking tragedy only finds those who court it. The banker's wife suggested I might have driven him to drink. Said a man with a contented wife doesn't seek comfort in a bottle. Martha's knife stilled. Maybe she was right. Maybe if I'd been different, softer, more like what he expected when he sent for me from St. Louis. Mail-order bride? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Nothing shameful in that. Lots of men out here send for wives. A lot of women looking for a fresh start, too. He moved to the stove, stirring the pot of beans she'd set to warm. From what I've seen, you're plenty soft where it counts. Takes a tender heart to mourn a man who disappointed you. Martha turned away, blinking hard. She hadn't cried since the funeral, hadn't allowed herself that release. He wasn't a bad man, just weak. The frontier was harder than he expected. The work, the isolation. He'd been a clerk back east. Thought mining would be easy money. It never is. They ate quietly. The only sounds the pop of the fire and the distant call of a hawk. Afterward, Elias showed her his mending pile, shirts with torn seams, socks wearing thin at the heels. Martha took up a needle gratefully, glad for work that would keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. Tell me about your sister, she said after a while. Curious about the woman whose clothes she wore. Elias's hands paused in their work, oiling a trap. Rebecca, she was younger than me by 10 years. Followed me out here after our parents died. Said she couldn't bear to stay in Ohio alone. She lived here with you? For a time. I tried to convince her to stay in town. Find herself a husband, but she was stubborn. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Said she'd rather keep house for her brother than marry some fool who'd expect her to pretend she couldn't think for herself. Martha smiled despite herself. I think I would have liked her. You would have. She had opinions on everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Used to say the mountains suited her because they didn't talk back. His voice roughened. The fever took her fast. 3 days from first symptom to. By the time I got her to town, it was too late. I'm sorry, Martha said again, meaning it. She understood the weight of that kind of loss, the guilt that came with surviving. She's buried in the meadow out back. Elias continued, marked with a stone I carved myself. I think about leaving sometimes, starting fresh somewhere else. But then who'd tend her grave? Who'd remember she was here? The afternoon stretched on, filled with small tasks and careful conversation. Martha learned that Elias had fought in the war between the states, though he didn't say for which side, and she didn't ask. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, daughter of a seamstress, how she'd answered Samuel's advertisement out of desperation after her mother died. I thought it would be an adventure, she admitted. Thought the frontier would be, I don't know, romantic, I suppose, like the dime novels make it sound. Instead, you got mud in mining towns and men who can't live up to their promises. Something like that. As evening approached, Elias prepared to spend another night in the lean-to, but Martha stopped him. This is your home. I won't drive you from it in the middle of winter. The cabin's big enough for both of us to sleep warm without impropriety. He hesitated, clearly torn between practicality and propriety. People would talk if they knew. People already talk. At least this way we'll both survive the night with our toes attached. In the end, pragmatism won. Elias strung a rope across one corner of the cabin and hung a blanket for privacy, creating a small space for Martha. He took his bedroll near the fire, careful to maintain proper distance. It was an awkward arrangement, but it worked. That night, Martha lay listening to the sounds of the cabin, the settling logs, the crackle of the banked fire, Elias's quiet breathing. For the first time since Samuel's death, She felt something approaching peace. Not happiness, not yet, but a lessening of the tight band around her chest. "Elias," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you, for everything." There was a long pause before he answered. "We all need help sometimes. Martha, doesn't make us weak, makes us human." She thought about that as sleep finally took her, about the difference between begging and accepting freely given aid, about the strange comfort of not being alone in the wilderness. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but inside the cabin, two broken souls had found a moment of warmth against the cold. The second storm arrived a week later, fiercer than the first. It howled down from the peaks like a living thing, trapping them inside for 3 solid days. By then, Martha and Elias had fallen into a routine. She cooked and mended while he hunted and maintained their supplies. They worked together with the quiet efficiency of those who understood the value of conserving energy in winter. On the second day of the storm, Elias taught her to set snares. His hands guided hers as she learned the proper tension, the best placement. "Rabbits follow the same paths," he explained, his breath warm against her ear. "Find their trails, set your snare low, and wait." Martha tried not to notice how natural it felt, working beside him, how her loneliness had eased into something almost like contentment. It was dangerous, this warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She was a widow of barely 2 weeks, carrying another man's child. She had no business feeling whatever this was. But when the storm cleared and they ventured out to check the snares, finding 3 fat rabbits, she couldn't help the smile that broke across her face. "I did it." Elias's answering grin transformed his usually solemn features. "You're a natural." Rebecca never could get the hang of it. Said it was too much like sewing with sticks. They dressed the rabbits together, Elias showing her how to preserve the pelts. "Come spring, you'll have enough for mittens. The baby will need them next winter." The casual way he spoke of the future, their future, made something flutter in Martha's chest. She pushed the feeling down, focusing on the work at hand. That evening, as rabbit stew simmered on the stove, Martha felt the first real movement from the baby. Not the gentle flutters she'd grown accustomed to, but a proper kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. "What is it?" Elias was beside her instantly, concern written across his face. "The baby, it's really moving." Without thinking, she grabbed his hand and placed it where she'd felt the kick. They both froze, realizing the intimacy of the gesture. But before either could pull away, the baby kicked again. Elias's eyes widened with wonder. "Strong little fellow. Or girl," Martha said softly. "Or girl," he agreed, his hand still resting lightly on her belly. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched like taffy, sweet and dangerous. Then the baby kicked once more, breaking the spell, and Elias stepped back. I'll see to the wood," he said roughly, grabbing his coat and escaping into the cold. Martha stood alone, her hand where his had been, feeling the echo of warmth. "What are we doing, little one?" she whispered. "What are we doing?" The next morning brought clear skies and a revelation. Elias returned from his dawn hunt, empty-handed but excited. "Found something you should see." He led her up a gentle slope behind the cabin to a small, natural hot spring, steam rising in delicate wisps from the surface. Rebecca discovered it our first winter, said it was better than any fancy bathhouse in Cincinnati. Martha stared at the gently bubbling water, longing written plain on her face. It had been weeks since she'd had a proper wash. "But it wouldn't be. I'll be hunting the North Ridge," Elias said firmly. "Won't be back till midday. What you do while I'm gone is your business." He left before she could protest, taking his rifle and disappearing into the trees. Martha stood irresolute for all of 30 seconds before the lure of hot water won. She shed her clothes quickly, gasping as the cold air hit her skin, then sank into the spring with a moan of pure pleasure. The water was perfect, hot enough to ease her aching muscles, but not so hot as to be dangerous for the baby. She floated, feeling weightless for the first time in months. watching steam rise into the crystal blue sky. For a moment, she let herself imagine this was her life. The cabin, the mountains, the quiet man who asked for nothing but gave so much. Dangerous thoughts. She ducked under the water as if she could wash them away. When she returned to the cabin, pink-cheeked and refreshed, she found Elias had already returned, a young doe slung over his shoulders. He glanced at her damp hair but said nothing, just set about dressing the deer with practiced efficiency. "Thought you'd be gone till midday," she said. "Luck was with me." He didn't look at her as he worked. "Got what I went for quick enough." They spent the afternoon smoking meat and preparing hides. Martha had helped with such work before, but never on this scale. Elias showed her how to scrape the hide properly, how to stretch it on a frame he built from saplings. Their hands occasionally brushed as they worked, each touch sending sparks through her that had nothing to do with the cold. That night, as they sat by the fire, Elias working on a new snare while Martha knitted tiny socks from unraveled wool, she found herself talking about the child. "Samuel wanted a son," she said quietly. "Someone to carry on his name, follow in his footsteps. Though what footsteps those would have been, I can't say. He could barely carry water without spilling half." Elias looked up from his work. "What do you want?" The question surprised her. No one had ever asked. I want the baby to be healthy, to be strong, to have choices I didn't have. Boy or girl, doesn't matter." She managed a small smile. "Though a girl might be easier. I could teach her what I know, sewing, cooking, how to make do with a boy." She trailed off. "A boy would need a man's teaching," Elias finished quietly. "How to hunt, track, build, how to be honorable in a world that doesn't always reward honor." Their eyes met across the fire, and Martha saw the unspoken offer there. It terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know enough." His voice was steady. "Sure. I know you're brave, faced down wolves and weather that would have killed most. I know you're proud, but not too proud to accept help when needed. I know you're grieving a man who didn't deserve you, but you're loyal enough to grieve him anyway." "Elias, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Just saying that come spring, if you decide Elmwood isn't where you want to be, well, this cabin's awful big for just one person." Martha's hand stilled on the tiny socks. People would talk. An unwed woman, a baby with no father, living with a man who isn't her husband. Let them talk. His jaws set stubbornly. "Up here, we make our own rules. Rebecca always said the mountains don't care about propriety, just survival." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. Martha watched them rise and disappear, thinking about choices and chances, about the weight of other people's opinions versus the warmth of a good man's regard. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to mourn properly, to—" "You'll have it," Elias assured her. "All the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Later, lying in her curtained corner, Martha pressed her hands to her belly and felt the baby respond. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, she was warm, safe, no longer alone. She thought about Samuel, about the life she'd thought she'd have with him, respectable, predictable, hollow as a rotted log. Then she thought about Alice, about strong hands gentle with snare wire and rabbit pelts, about eyes that saw her truly, about a future that might be scandalous by town standards but felt more honest than anything she'd known. "What should we do, little one?" she whispered. "What should we do?" The baby kicked, and Martha chose to take it as an answer. "Stay," it seemed to say. "Stay where you're valued. Stay where you're warm. Stay where someone looks at you and sees not a burden or a scandal, but a partner. Stay." The rider appeared on a gray afternoon in late January, his horse struggling through the knee-deep snow. Martha saw him first from the window where she'd been watching for Elias's return from his trap line. Something about the man's posture, alert, predatory, made her stomach clench with dread. "Someone's coming," she called to Elias. who had just entered through the back door, shaking snow from his coat. He moved to the window swiftly, his hand going automatically to the rifle by the door. "Get back from the glass," he said quietly. "Go to your corner and stay there." But Martha remained beside him, studying the approaching figure. "You know him." "Maybe, can't tell from here." But the tension in his shoulders said otherwise. The rider stopped a good 50 feet from the cabin, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Elias Thornton," he called out. "I know you're in there. Come on out, peaceful like, just want to talk." Elias's jaw tightened. "That's Jake Morrison, bounty hunter out of Coyote Creek. The reward still stands, then?" "Appears so." He checked his rifle. Movements calm despite the situation. $300, last I heard. Enough to make a man ride through a Wyoming winter. Martha felt anger bloom hot in her chest. 3 years Elias had lived here peacefully, hurting no one, and still they hunted him for a crime he didn't commit. "What do we do?" He glanced at her, something soft flickering in his eyes at her use of we. "You don't do anything. This is my trouble. Your trouble became mine the night you saved my life." Before he could argue, she was pulling on her shawl. Elias caught her arm. "Martha, no, you don't know what kind of man Morrison is. I know exactly what kind." She thought of the women in town, their whispers and judgment. "I've met his type before." She stepped out onto the porch before Elias could stop her, keeping her hands visible but her chin high. The bounty hunter's eyes widened slightly at her appearance. A pregnant woman was clearly not what he'd expected. "Afternoon," she said pleasantly, as if greeting any visitor. "Cold ride you've had. There's coffee on the stove if you'd care for some." Morrison's hand stayed near his gun. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Elias Thornton. Man's wanted in Coyote Creek." "My husband's name is Elias," Martha said, the lie flowing smooth as honey. "But you must have the wrong man. We've been here near on 4 years now, ever since we married." "Your husband, you say?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, taking in her obvious condition. "Funny. Word in town was Thornton lived alone up here. Towns do love their gossip." She placed a protective hand on her belly, though I can't imagine why anyone would care about our domestic arrangements. Elias emerged then, rifle held loose but ready. "Mr. Morrison, long way from Coyote Creek. Not so long when there's $300 at the end of it." Morrison's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Though seems you've been busy since you left. Didn't know you'd taken a wife. Man finds solace where he can after being run out of town by lies." Elias moved to stand beside Martha, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've made a new life here, legal and proper. No call to disturb it." Morrison dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Legal and proper, you say? Wouldn't happen to have any proof of this marriage? Papers and such?" Martha felt Elias tense beside her, but she laughed, the sound carrying across the snow. "Papers? Mister, the nearest justice of the peace is 2 days' ride in good weather. Preacher comes through maybe twice a year. We spoke our vows before God and these mountains. That's proof enough for anyone who matters." "Maybe so," Morrison said, but his eyes stayed cold, calculating. "Still, I've come all this way. Hate to go back empty-handed. Perhaps if I could look around a bit, satisfy myself that you're really the domestic man you claim to be." "No." Elias's voice was flat. "You're not welcome here. Turn your horse around and ride on." Morrison's hand drifted closer to his gun. "Now that's not very neighborly." "Neighborly?" Martha stepped forward, fury overtaking caution. "You ride up here, threatening my husband, disturbing my home, endangering my unborn child with your presence. And you speak of neighborly." She pressed a hand to her side, gasping theatrically. Oh, the upset." Elias caught her instantly, concern replacing wariness. "Martha?" She leaned into him, speaking loud enough for Morrison to hear. "It's the baby. The strain. Please, I need to lie down." Morrison looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight. Even bounty hunters, it seemed, had qualms about distressing pregnant women. "Ma'am, I didn't mean—" "Then leave," Elias said coldly. "You've done enough damage. And if you're thinking of coming back, remember this. I've survived 3 winters in these mountains. I know every trail, every hiding spot, every way to make a man disappear without a trace. The mountains keep their secrets. Morrison, you'd do well to remember that." The threat hung in the air like ice crystals. Morrison studied them both, weighing $300 against the very real danger in Elias's eyes. Finally, he mounted his horse. "This isn't over. Thornton, that bounty's still good. Others will come." "Let them," Elias said. "They'll find the same welcome you did." They watched Morrison ride away until he was just a speck against the white landscape. Only then did Martha allow herself to sag against Elias, the false weakness becoming real as reaction set in. "Inside," Elias said urgently, guiding her to the cabin. "Are you truly unwell?" "I'm fine," she assured him once they were safe behind barred doors. "But I've seen men like him back down when faced with feminine distress. They can shoot a man without blinking but grow squeamish at women's troubles." Elias sank into a chair, running hands through his hair. "You shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have lied for me. Now you're tangled in this mess. I was tangled the moment I accepted your help." Martha busied herself making tea, needing the familiar routine. Besides, it was barely a lie. "We do live as husband and wife, in all ways but one." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Elias looked at her then, really looked, and Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Martha, I know what I said." She met his gaze steadily. "I know what it means. Morrison will spread word. Others will come, as he said. Your only protection might be the claim of marriage, of family. A man with a wife and child is less likely to run, less likely to be a threat. You'd do that? Tie yourself to a wanted man?" She thought of the weeks they'd spent together, the quiet rhythms of their shared days, how he'd never once made her feel beholden or lesser, how he looked at her, not as a burden or a scandal, but as a partner worthy of respect. "You're only wanted because you're honorable," she said softly, "because you wouldn't let them blame you for another's crime. I'd be proud to call you husband, Elias Thornton, if you'd have us." He stood slowly, crossing to where she waited by the stove. His hands framed her face gently, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Have you, Martha Coleman? I'd have you if you came with 12 children and twice as many troubles. You're the finest woman I've known since Rebecca, and that's saying something considerable." The kiss was inevitable then, soft and careful, mindful of her condition and their strange courtship. Martha leaned into it, feeling something broken inside her finally begin to mend. When they parted, she was crying, the first tears she'd shed since Samuel's death. "What is it?" Elias asked, alarmed. "Did I presume?" "No." She caught his hands, holding them tight. "It's just, I thought I'd never feel this again. Wanted, valued, like I was more than just someone to cook and clean and bear children in silence. You're everything," he said simply. "You and the little one both. And I'll protect you from Morrison and anyone else who tries to disturb our peace." That night, they moved Martha's things from behind the curtain. She lay beside Elias in the bed he'd built with his own hands, feeling the solid warmth of him, the safety of being held. The baby moved between them, and Elias spread his hand over her belly, marveling. "Soon," he said, "spring will come, and with it, new life. And new challenges," Martha reminded him. "Morrison won't give up easily, then we'll face them together." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "That's what family does." Family. The word settled around them like a blessing, warming the cabin against the winter dark. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Morrison's tracks, hiding their small sanctuary from the harsh world beyond. But inside, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds began to build something stronger than weather or want or the judgment of distant towns. Love, Martha thought, surprising herself with the word. Yes, this was love. Unexpected, unconventional, but real as the mountains themselves. They came at dawn 3 weeks later, Morrison and 2 others, moving through the morning mist like wolves. Elias spotted them from the ridge where he'd been checking his trap line, their horses leaving dark trails through the frost-covered meadow below. He abandoned the half-skinned rabbit and ran. Martha was kneading bread when he burst through the door. One look at his face told her everything. How many? 3. Morrison brought friends. He was already reaching for his rifle, checking ammunition. Get to the root cellar. Take water, blankets, the medical supplies. I'm not hiding while You're 7 months along, Martha. His voice was fierce. You'll do as I say. She might have argued, but a sharp cramp seized her middle, making her gasp and clutch the table. Elias was beside her instantly. Just the worry, she breathed. It's past. But they both knew the truth. Strain and fear could bring the baby early. And out here, that meant death for both mother and child. Elias's face went hard as granite. The cellar, now! This time she didn't argue. While Elias barricaded windows and prepared for siege, Martha gathered supplies. Her hands shook as she wrapped preserves in cloth, filled canteens from the water barrel. Another cramp hit, lighter but unmistakable. Not now, she prayed. Please, not now. The root cellar was cold and dark, barely tall enough for her to stand upright. Elias had reinforced it over the years, turning it from simple storage into something that could serve as shelter if needed. He helped her down, spreading blankets on the packed earth floor. If something happens, he began. Nothing will happen. She caught his face between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You hear me, Elias Thornton? You'll be smart and careful and come back to us. He kissed her hard, desperately, then pulled away. Bar the door from inside. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you. Then he was gone, and Martha was alone in the darkness with only the baby's restless movements for company. The first shot came minutes later, the crack of it muffled by earth and wood but still audible. Martha pressed her hands over her belly, whispering prayers and promises. More shots followed, scattered and sharp. She could picture Elias moving through the cabin, using every window, making it seem like more than one man defended the place. Time crawled. The shooting stopped, started again. Once, she heard horses neighing in distress, then silence, worse than gunfire because she couldn't know what it meant. The cramps continued, irregular but insistent. Martha tried to time them, using her heartbeat as a rough measure. Too close together, too strong for false labor. She bit her lip to keep from crying out when a particularly sharp pain lanced through her. Footsteps above made her freeze. Heavy boots, not Elias's familiar tread. Morrison's voice, muffled but recognizable. Check everywhere. Man's gotta be here somewhere. He coulda run, another voice suggested. Took to the mountains when he saw us coming. And leave his pregnant wife. Morrison scoffed. No, he's here. Probably hit and holed up somewhere. Check that lean-to again. Martha held her breath as the footsteps moved away. Where was Elias? The silence from him was terrifying. She'd heard no cry of pain, but men could die quietly. She knew. Samuel had made barely a sound when the mine took him. Another contraction hit, strong enough that she had to stuff her fist in her mouth to muffle the moan. Liquid warmth flooded between her legs. Her water had broken. The baby was coming now. Ready or not. Panic clawed at her throat. She couldn't do this alone. Couldn't birth a child in a root cellar while killers stalked overhead. But what choice did she have? To cry out meant death for all of them. She fumbled in the darkness for the medical supplies, finding clean cloth by touch. The contractions were coming faster now, each one a wave of pressure and pain that threatened to tear her apart. She braced against the earthen wall, trying to remember everything she'd learned from attending her cousin's birth years ago. Gunfire erupted again, closer this time. Someone screamed. Not Elias, she was certain. The sound of it, agonized and brief, gave her hope. He was still fighting, still alive. He's in the trees! Morrison's voice, angry now. Circle around! Cut him off! More shots, but scattered. Wild. They'd lost track of him. Martha smiled grimly through another contraction. Elias knew these woods like his own heartbeat. 3 men from town wouldn't catch him easily. But the baby wouldn't wait for the fight to end. The pressure was building. Unbearable. Undeniable. Martha spread the blankets as best she could, positioned herself against the wall. Every instinct screamed to push, but she held back, panting through the pain. Too fast. This was happening too fast. A crash from above, splintering wood, breaking glass. Fighting inside the cabin now. She heard bodies colliding, furniture overturning. A shot, impossibly loud. Then another. Someone fell hard enough to shake dust from the cellar ceiling. Martha couldn't hold back the cry that tore from her throat as the next contraction peaked. She pressed both hands over her mouth, but too late. Footsteps above paused. You hear that? Morrison, alert as a hunting dog. Wind, his companion said uncertainly. That wasn't wind. Slow steps. Searching. Check for a cellar. These mountain rats always have bolt holes. Terror gave Martha strength. She dragged herself deeper into the cellar's shadows, behind barrels of preserves, but there was no hiding from what her body demanded. The baby was coming now, crowning, sending fire through every nerve. The cellar door rattled. Locked from inside, Morrison called. Lady must be down there. Leave her, the other man urged. We got no quarrel with a woman. She's our leverage. Thornton'll come running if we have her. Something slammed against the door, a boot or rifle butt. The bar held, but barely. Another blow, another. Wood splintered. Martha bit through her lip as she pushed, tasting blood. The baby's head emerged in a rush of fluid and pain. No time to be careful. No time for anything but instinct. She reached down, guiding, supporting, as her body did what women had done since time began. The door gave way with a crash. Lamplight flooded the cellar, momentarily blinding her. Morrison stood at the top of the stairs, pistol in hand, his face savage with triumph. Then he saw her clearly, crouched in the shadows, skirts soaked with blood and birth water, a baby half-born between her legs. His face went white. Jesus Christ, he breathed, the gun wavering. It was the hesitation Elias needed. He came from behind like vengeance itself, knife sliding between Morrison's ribs before the bounty hunter could turn. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock. The pistol fell from nerveless fingers, clattering down the wooden steps. Martha! Elias was down the stairs in 2 bounds, dropping beside her just as she gave a final, desperate push. The baby slid free in a rush. Tiny and perfect and absolutely still. No! Martha sobbed, gathering the infant to her chest. No, please! Elias's hands joined hers, rougher but infinitely gentle. He cleared the baby's mouth, rubbed its back. Nothing. The tiny chest remained motionless. Please, Martha whispered, rocking the still form. Please, little one. We've come so far. Please. Elias bent over the baby, covering its mouth and nose with his own, breathing gentle puffs of air. Once, twice, 3 times. The seconds stretched like hours. Then, a cough, a thin, angry wail that was the most beautiful sound Martha had ever heard. The baby's skin flushed pink as it drew breath after breath, protesting this rude entry into the world. A girl, Elias said wonderingly. Martha, it's a girl. She was sobbing now, great gulping sobs of relief and joy and delayed terror. Elias wrapped them both in his arms, heedless of blood and mess, pressing kisses to Martha's hair. The others? She managed to ask. Gone. 1 dead, 1 run off. He glanced up at Morrison's still form. This one won't trouble us again. I was so frightened. Shh. You were magnificent. Both of you. He looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was blinking up at them with dark, curious eyes. What shall we call her? Martha thought of the darkness and fear, the pain and desperate hope. But mostly she thought of the man who'd fought 3 killers to keep them safe, who'd breathed life into their daughter when death tried to claim her. Hope, she said softly. Hope, Rebecca Thornton. Elias's eyes filled. Rebecca would have liked that. Later, After Morrison's body had been dealt with and Martha and the baby were cleaned and settled in the bed, Elias sat beside them, unable to stop touching them both, as if reassuring himself they were real. "She came early because of the strain," Martha said quietly. "I'm sorry. If I hadn't—" "Don't." He kissed her forehead. "You protected her the only way you could. And she's here. She's healthy. That's all that matters." Hope made a small sound, rooting against Martha's breast, as she began to nurse. Elias wrapped his arms around them both, creating a circle of warmth and safety that no bounty hunter could breach. "They'll send more," Martha said after a while. "Let them come." His voice was fierce with new purpose. "I've got more to protect now than just myself. They'll learn what that means." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the violence of the morning with pristine white. But inside, a family forged in hardship and sealed in blood began their true life together, stronger for having been tested by fire. The decision to return to Coyote Creek came with the spring thaw. Hope was 2 months old, round-cheeked and thriving despite her dramatic arrival. Martha had recovered fully, her strength returning with each passing day. But the shadow of Elias's fugitive status hung over their happiness like a storm cloud. "We can't live like this forever," Martha said one morning, watching Hope sleep in the cradle Elias had carved. "Always watching, waiting for the next bounty hunter. She deserves better." Elias stood at the window, studying the melting snow. "Going back means risking everything. They might hang me before I get a chance to speak, or they might listen." Martha joined him, slipping her hand into his. "The man who really stole those cattle, Brennan's nephew, he might have made mistakes by now. 3 years is a long time for a guilty conscience. You have more faith in human nature than I do. I have faith in justice, and in you." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, we won't go alone." The journey took 4 days, with frequent stops to nurse Hope and rest the horses. Elias had fashioned a sling for Martha to carry the baby against her chest, keeping her warm and secure. They camped under the stars, and Martha found herself oddly at peace despite what lay ahead. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Coyote Creek hadn't changed much. The same dusty main street, the same weathered buildings, the same faces that turned to stare as they rode in. Martha kept her chin high, meeting every gaze steadily. Let them look. Let them see Elias Thornton returning of his own free will, with a wife and child beside him. They stopped first at the home of Judge Samuel Cartwright, the only man in town Elias had named as potentially fair. The judge's housekeeper answered the door, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Tell Judge Cartwright that Elias Thornton has come to clear his name," Elias said calmly. "I'll wait in his study if he'll see me." The judge appeared within minutes, still adjusting his vest. He was an older man with sharp eyes and silver whiskers, known for his love of law books and distaste for mob justice. "Thornton," he said, studying them all. "This is unexpected." "Sir," Elias began, but Martha stepped forward. "Judge Cartwright, my husband has lived as a fugitive for 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. We've come to seek justice, real justice, not the kind that comes at the end of a rope." The judge's eyebrows rose. "Your husband, you say?" "My wife, Martha." Elias confirmed, "And our daughter, Hope." "I see." Cartwright gestured to chairs. "Sit, tell me everything." They talked for over an hour. Elias recounted the night the cattle went missing, his certainty that Thomas Brennan, the rancher's nephew, had taken them to pay gambling debts. Martha described their life in the mountains, the bounty hunters, Morrison's death defending their home. "Morrison's dead." The judge leaned forward. "You killed him. He broke into our home," Martha said firmly, "threatened our baby. Any man would have done the same." Cartwright was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thomas Brennan left town 2 years ago, but before he went, there were rumors, other thefts, a pattern of behavior that suggested earlier accusations might have been misplaced." Hope stirred in Martha's arms, making soft sounds. The judge's stern expression softened slightly at the sight of her. "I'll call a proper hearing," he decided, Tomorrow, in the courthouse, you'll have your chance to speak. Thornton. But I can't guarantee the outcome. Feelings still run high about those stolen cattle. All I ask is a chance. Elias said. They spent the night in the town's small boarding house, Martha barely sleeping. Elias paced their room, hope in his arms, whispering promises to her about the life they'd have when this was over. Martha watched them, her heart full of love and fear in equal measure. The courthouse was packed the next morning. Word had spread quickly. Elias Thornton had returned. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility. Martha recognized several men from the ranch, including old Brennan himself, his weathered face unreadable. Judge Cartwright called for order. This is a hearing, not a trial. We're here to examine new evidence in the matter of the cattle stolen from the Brennan Ranch 3 years past. Elias stood, shoulders squared. He spoke simply, without dramatics, recounting the facts as he knew them. His years of solitude had given his words weight. This was not a man given to lies or excuses. Then came the surprise witness. Mary Brennan, the rancher's daughter, rose from the back of the room, pretty and composed. She'd been away at school when the theft occurred, but had returned to disturbing discoveries. I found letters, she said, her clear voice carrying through the courthouse. In my cousin Thomas's room after he left, letters discussing debts, mentioning cattle that could be sold quickly across the border. She produced a packet of papers. I should have come forward sooner, but he's family, and I hoped— She trailed off. But the damage was done. The letters were damning, full of details only the thief would know. The crowd murmured, opinions shifting like wind-blown sand. Old Brennan stood suddenly. The girl speaks truth, he said heavily. I have suspected for some time. Thomas always was weak, too fond of cards and whiskey. I let my affection blind me, blamed an innocent man rather than face the shame of my own blood. The silence that followed was profound. Martha reached for Elias's hand, holding it tight. Judge Cartwright cleared his throat. Given this new evidence, I see no reason to pursue charges against Elias Thornton. The matter of Jake Morrison's death appears to be clear self-defense. Mr. Thornton, you're free to go. Free. The words seemed to echo in the room. Elias stood frozen, as if afraid to believe it. Then Hope let out a cry, hungry, impatient, wonderfully alive, and the spell broke. People surrounded them, some offering apologies, others merely curious about the baby. Mary Brennan approached, tears on her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she whispered. If I'd known you had a family depending on you, you spoke up when it mattered. Martha told her, that takes courage. They stayed in town 3 more days, letting the reality of freedom sink in. Several ranchers offered Elias work, but he politely declined. On their last morning, as they prepared to leave, Judge Cartwright pulled him aside. That land you've been living on, it's unclaimed. File a homestead claim. Make it legal. You've more than earned it. Elias nodded. 2 moved to speak. The ride home was different from the journey out. The weight was gone from Elias's shoulders, and he smiled more in those 4 days than Martha had seen in all their months together. Hope seemed to sense the change, gurgling happily in her sling. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the cabin below, Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. Home, their home, legally and properly now. That night, as Hope slept in her cradle and spring peepers sang outside the windows, Elias pulled Martha close. We should have a proper wedding, he said, now that we can make honest folk of ourselves. Martha laughed softly. Elias Thornton, are you proposing to me? Seems I am. He kissed her tenderly. Martha Coleman, will you marry me again, properly this time? Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. To you, to this life, to our future. They were married 2 weeks later in the meadow where Rebecca lay buried. The traveling preacher who performed the ceremony seemed bemused by their story, but blessed them nonetheless. Hope cooed throughout the service, adding her voice to the vows. as spring bloomed fully around them, bringing wildflowers and new life to the mountain. Martha stood in the doorway of their cabin watching Elias work the garden plot they'd cleared. Hope slept against her chest, peaceful and content. She thought of that desperate night in the blizzard, of her proud declaration that she'd starve before she'd beg. How young and foolish she'd been, thinking survival meant standing alone. True strength, she'd learned, came from knowing when to accept help, when to offer trust, when to build something greater than yourself. "Elias," she called, "supper's ready." He looked up, smiling that smile that still made her heart skip. "Coming, Mrs. Thornton." Mrs. Thornton. Yes, she thought, returning his smile. That's exactly who she was meant to be. Spring melted into summer, and with it came the full flowering of their mountain home. The expanded cabin stood proud against the tree line, its new rooms testament to Elias's skill and determination. He'd worked through the warming months, adding a proper bedroom, a small parlor, and a covered porch where Martha could sit with Hope and watch the sunset paint the peaks gold. The garden thrived under Martha's care. Neat rows of vegetables stretched toward the sun, potatoes, beans, squash, and corn. She'd planted flowers, too, seeds brought from town on their last supply run. Black-eyed Susans and wild roses now framed the doorway, their bright faces a cheerful greeting to anyone who approached. Hope had grown into a laughing, curious child of 6 months, with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. She could sit up on her own now, reaching for everything within her grasp, babbling stories only she understood. Elias had fashioned a high chair from pine, and she presided over their meals like a tiny queen, occasionally decorating herself with whatever food came within range. On this particular morning, Martha stood at the creek's edge, washing clothes while Hope played on a blanket nearby. The water ran clear and cold, snowmelt from the high peaks. She hummed as she worked, an old hymn her mother had taught her, watching the sunlight dance on the ripples. "You sound happy," Elias said, approaching with a string of fresh trout. "I am happy." She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "Happier than I ever thought possible." He set the fish aside and pulled her up, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh and protest about her wet hands. "Good. You deserve all the happiness this world can offer." "We both do," she corrected, stretching up to kiss him. Hope chose that moment to voice her own opinion, a delighted squeal that sent birds fluttering from nearby branches. They turned to find her holding a particularly interesting pine cone, examining it with intense concentration. "She'll be walking soon," Elias observed. "Lord help us then." "We'll manage," Martha said, leaning into his embrace. "We always do." They'd had visitors throughout the summer. The traveling preacher who'd married them properly returned with news from the settlements. A few hardy traders passed through with goods to barter. And once, unexpectedly, Mary Brennan had ridden up with her new husband to see how they fared. "I needed to see for myself that you were well," she'd said, admiring the cabin and cooing over Hope. "Father sends his regards. He's different now. Quieter. I think the guilt weighs on him." "Tell him we hold no grudge," Elias had said simply. "What's done is done." Now, as autumn approached with its crisp mornings and golden afternoons, Martha felt the deep contentment of a life well lived. They had food stored for winter, wood stacked high, and each other. What more could anyone need? One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the valley, they sat on the porch watching Hope attempt to crawl. She'd get up on all fours, rock back and forth with great determination, then plop back down with a frustrated grunt. "Just like her mother," Elias teased, "stubborn as a mule." "And her father," Martha retorted, "too proud to give up." Hope, as if to prove them both right, tried again. This time she managed one forward motion before tumbling. Elias scooped her up, lifting her high until she shrieked with laughter. "That's my girl," he said. "You'll be racing through these mountains before we know it." Martha smiled, remembering her own words from that terrible night in the storm. "I'll starve before I beg," she murmured. Elias looked at her questioningly. Just thinking about how far we've come, she explained. That night you found me. I was so determined to need no one, to owe nothing. I thought accepting help meant weakness. And now, she gestured, encompassing their home, their daughter, the life they'd built. Now I know that real strength comes from connection, from building something together that neither could manage alone. The mountains taught you that? You taught me that, she corrected. You and Hope in this place, we're not just surviving out here. Elias, we're thriving. As if in agreement, Hope reached for them both, babbling her evening song. They sat together as the first stars appeared, a family forged in hardship, but defined by love. The next morning brought the first frost, delicate crystals coating the grass like nature's lace. Winter would come again, with its storms and challenges. But Martha felt no fear. They had warmth and food, strong walls and stronger bonds. She stood in the doorway with her morning coffee, watching Elias teach Hope to wave goodbye to the geese flying south. The baby's chubby hand moved enthusiastically, though her timing was off by several seconds. Bye-bye, Hope said suddenly, her first clear word. Martha gasped, nearly dropping her cup. Elias, did you hear? I heard. His grin was wide as the sky. Say it again. Little one, say bye-bye. Bye-bye, Hope repeated, delighted with her new power. They spent the morning encouraging more words, rewarded with papa by noon and something that might have been mama by evening. Each utterance was celebrated like a great victory, because in their small world, it was... That night, after Hope was asleep in her crib, Martha and Elias sat by the fire planning for the future. They talked of adding more rooms as their family grew, of teaching Hope to read and write, of perhaps building a small schoolhouse if other settlers came to the valley. Do you ever regret it? Elias asked suddenly. The life you might have had in town? Comfort, society, an easier path? Martha considered the question seriously. I thought I wanted those things once, respectability, acceptance, a normal life. But this, she gestured to their sturdy cabin, to him, to their sleeping daughter. This is worth more than all the social acceptance in the world, even when the winters are hard, when the nearest neighbor is a day's ride away. Especially then, she said firmly, because we face it together, because every challenge overcome makes us stronger, because our daughter will grow up knowing that love isn't about what others think, it's about what you build with your own hands and heart. Elias pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. Have I told you today that I love you? Only a dozen times, she said, smiling. Tell me again. I love you, Martha Thornton. I love our daughter. I love this life we've made. And I love you. She whispered back, forever and always. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, and the creek sang its endless song. The mountains stood eternal, guarding their small paradise, and inside the cabin, a family that had begun in desperation and bloomed in adversity settled in for another peaceful night, grateful for every hard-won blessing. Hope stirred in her sleep, murmuring baby dreams. Martha rose to check on her, smoothing the soft dark hair so like Elias's, looking down at her daughter's peaceful face. She remembered that desperate prayer in the root cellar. Please, little one, we've come so far. They had come far indeed. From that frozen night when she'd whispered, I'll starve before I beg, to this warm home filled with love and laughter. The journey had taught her that sometimes the greatest strength lay in accepting help, that pride could be both shield and prison, and that love, real love, was worth any risk. Sweet dreams, my hope, she whispered, then returned to Elias's arms and the warmth of their fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. Winter would test them again, as it always did. But tonight, in their mountain refuge, all was well. They had food and shelter, purpose and peace, and most importantly, they had each other. The Wild West had shaped them, challenged them, nearly broken them. But in the end, it had given them everything that truly mattered, a home, a family, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. And that, Martha thought as she drifted off to sleep, safe in her husband's embrace, was worth more than all the gold in California. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival in the Old West. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about Martha and Elias's journey in the comments below. Did their story touch your heart? What would you have done in their place? Let's gather round our virtual campfire and share our thoughts on this tale of courage, redemption, and the power of love to transform even the harshest circumstances.